My name is Grace. I'm one of the directors for Women Who Code. Apologies for the background noise. This is the joy of working from home. For Women Who Code's Denver Boulder chapter, and we're really excited for this event tonight. We had initially planned for this to be in person at Xero's office in Denver, and obviously that changed, but it's been really wonderful to work with the Xero team through transferring this to a virtual event, and so awesome to see all of the support. So we're really excited to get things started. Before we do, and before I hand it off to the Xero team, I just wanted to note that there will be a Q&A section at the end, but please, please, please ask questions throughout. And to ask questions, just click the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Make sure you're sending the question to all panelists, and then send along any questions that you have throughout. If they're small, the panelists will go ahead and answer them, and if they're bigger questions, we'll hit them at the end. So with that, I'll hand it off to Nicole.
Hey there, thanks Grace, and hi everyone. My name is Nicole Reed and I'm the Chief People Officer for Xero. And I'm dialing into this from my home in Sydney, Australia. So it's the morning for me, and I'm really, really excited to be here and joining this awesome event. So I have worked at Xero for about 18 months now. I've worked in financial services and tech companies all of my career, and it's always been in an HR capacity. So I'm very chuffed to be leading the HR function at an awesome company like Xero. So what I wanted to do is talk you through a few brief slides just to give you a bit of more information about Xero. And then I'm going to hand off to Brigitte from our talent experience team, who's going to give you some more details about careers at Xero and how you can find out more information. Okay, so a little bit about our organisation. We are a global platform for small businesses. That is the most kind of easiest definition I can give you. But more importantly, our purpose, which is what really, really galvanizes all of us at Xero, and there's 3,000 of us globally, is about making life better for people in small businesses around the world. And that includes their advisors, the accountants and the bookkeepers that work with the small businesses, and more broadly, the communities that engage with small businesses around the world. So it's a really, really noble purpose, and we all really, really do galvanize around it across the world. So if we go into the next slide, and our vision as an organisation is to be the most insightful and trusted small business platform. And so that's working right across the small business in terms of all of their tech and financials and all the things they need to run their business effectively. All right, if we keep moving through. So our strategy at Xero really centres around three big pillars or outcomes. It's our customers, our people, and Xero as an organisation. And, you know, from a customer perspective, it's about customers and partners are more successful and confident on the Xero platform. We want to have an outcome for our people, our Xeros, where we are doing the best work of our lives. And that from a Xero perspective, we are fulfilling all of our aspirations in terms of being a growth organisation and achieving all of the outcomes that we set out to do. And we've got a bunch of strategic themes that you can see underneath there that really help enable that vision for us. So I'll keep moving through. And this is a really important element about Xero and what it feels like to work at Xero and how we show up every day, and it's our values. There are 5 values: human, challenge, team, ownership, and beautiful. And this is really the glue that holds Xero together. And this is how we show up every day. It's how we treat each other. It's how we work together. And it extends to how we work with our customers and partners inside the broader Xero community. You know, in working at Xero, one of the things that everyone describes most is how we always talk about being #human. And that is the most pervasive value that we have. And this kind of gets to the heart of our strategy and our organisation is about our purpose, making the lives of small business owners better, and of course our people, all of the Xeros around the world, 3,000 of us globally, who really drive our brand and our customer experience to support our community. So a little bit more about Xero, in particular around diversity and inclusion, and this is why this is such an awesome event to be part of. We have a bunch of diversity and inclusion principles that really do drive all of our strategies and all of the programs of work that we have, whether it's in relation to creating a more inclusive culture, getting more women in tech, such as a great event like this, you know, committing to equal pay for equal work, you know, how we're really, really thinking about diverse talent, even beyond gender, and, you know, how we, you know, consider supporting our customers and our partners in the broader community in relation to diversity and inclusion. And a big, big focus, particularly for us over the past few years, has been around females and women representation in Xero. So the next slide is just going to show you a little bit, if we just progress to the next slide. Thanks, Erica. Around some progress that we are making, but we are continuing to focus on always. We have women on our board, we have women in our executive team, we have women in tech roles right across the organisation, and our broader you know, women representation right across the organisation. We have made progress, but we continue to focus on this because this is a really, really important part of our culture and of our strategy to be successful and in all of our growth aspirations. So that's just a little bit about Xero. I'm really, really happy to take questions, as Grace said, towards the back end of the presentation. But what I wanted to do is just throw over to Brigitte from our talent experience team, who's going to give you a little bit more information about how to find about roles in Xero. So over to you, Brigitte.
I was still on mute. Thanks, Nick. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Brigitte Bushnell. I'm a talent specialist in the Denver office. On behalf of the Xero Talent Experience team, I'm pleased to welcome you, albeit virtually, to this wonderful event, which we were hosting in the office. We certainly don't want to stand between you and the API workshop, but we did want to introduce ourselves as resources for you. And in the event that anyone here is interested in exploring careers with Xero, you're welcome to reach out to any of these smiling faces on the slide. Our email addresses are all listed below our photo, so you can see it's first name, last name @xero.com. I look like I'm wearing the same outfit as in that photo. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to throw a few resources up here if anyone would like to research Xero culture and careers further after tonight. The first link is to our LinkedIn Life page. So this is where you can learn more about Xero's mission and culture. But this link specifically will take you to our product and technology landing page, where you can learn more about the team's global makeup and what problems they're currently solving. From here, you can also access some great Medium articles that will give you more insight into the humans behind the product. Secondly, Built in Colorado. This is a resource many of you may be familiar with if you're local to the Denver and Boulder and surrounding areas. Built in Colorado highlights companies and trends in the Denver and Boulder tech industry, and this link is directly to our employer page. So here you can find articles that highlight our local teams, our culture here in Denver, and the benefits that we offer. So I would recommend checking out the company culture and perks and benefit tab across our employer page. Last but not least, the Xero Careers page, of course. This is where you can view all active and open roles across regions and teams at xero.com at any time. Next slide, please. And then finally, oh, there we go. I wanted to provide a quick synopsis of our 2020 hiring plan to the group. We currently have about 50 product and engineering hires slated for the rest of 2020 in 6 months across our Americas offices. Over a third are software development roles ranging from junior to senior. And we're also introducing a significant team lead layer to our teams to support this growth. The remaining 40% is going to be spread across data engineering, product management, design, agile, DevOps, and architecture. So quite a wide range of roles. Regardless of your passions or interests, we have some amazing roles and projects on the horizon. So if you're interested, we would welcome the opportunity to explore our careers at Xero with you further. And with that, I will hand it over to Erica.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brigitte. So my name is Erica, and I'm a backups engineer at Xero. If you have questions about what that is, feel free to ask those. And if you have any other questions that come up throughout the workshop, please ask them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer those at the end, or someone who can answer those for you will answer them. So we are going to build an API using Python and Flask today. So I want to make sure before I get into anything technical that you check that you have Python installed, you have Flask installed, you have some sort of code editor. I use Visual Studio Code. You can use No++ or Atom. And then if you are using a Windows computer, I recommend using Git Bash. I know this was on the README before, we started the workshop, but I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page. And before we get into building the API, in case you're not familiar with APIs, what is an API? An API is an application programming interface. So it's a set of functions and procedures that allow you to access the features of or data of another application or service. And it returns it in a format that allows you to use the data in your own application. So just an example of an API, the weather app. And how we use APIs at Xero. So I feel like to learn something, it's really relevant to just know why you'd want to use it and how you'd apply it in the workplace. So we use it to connect various parts of our platform. We use it to allow customers to access bank data, enable connections with other services in our ecosystem. So our platform allows our accounting customers to connect a lot of different services to their Xero software. So we use APIs in that. It allows us to connect backend and front-end components, and we use it to enforce authentication and authorization. And so I just want to talk about some workshop objectives and what I hope that you get out of this workshop. And again, feel free to give me any feedback you have at the end. We're going to talk about the basic structure of APIs, get familiar with how endpoints work. We're going to set up a virtual environment. We're going to get comfortable using Flask and Python for other projects. And we're going to take the initial repository that was available as a resource to you, and we're going to fill that out so that we get endpoints that work to have a running API. So again, just a reminder to make sure that you have all the things I mentioned before installed. And I just want to give everyone a quick 2 minutes or maybe even less. I'll be looking at the comments just to make sure that everyone has this. So please go ahead and set up the repositories on your computer. If you did not do that before the event, there's 2 repositories, an initial repository, which is parts of the API, but it's not completely set up, so it doesn't work yet because we're gonna work through that during the workshop, and a completed repository that you can look at to check how your endpoints came out compared to a finished API, or if you'd like to keep working on this kind of API or use this for reference, you can use that repository. This just has instructions for forking a repository, cloning it to your computer, and setting my repository as the upstream so that you can get any updates for any code updates I make. If you already have this set up, this probably isn't super relevant to you, but I just wanted everyone to get a chance to be working at the same pace. If you just want to watch and don't want to write any code or do anything while I'm presenting, that is totally okay too. So I'm gonna go ahead and see if anyone has said anything. If not, I'm just gonna take 1 more minute to give you all time to get that going, and then I'm gonna continue with everything else. So, okay. I didn't get any comments or anything, so I think we're okay to move on. So let's talk about the basics of how an API works. So this is the most simple version of code that you could have for an API. Oh, yes. Did I get a question? You raised your hand. Okay, and if you have questions about how to clone the repository or anything like that, please just ask them in the Zoom chat. There's a lot of other engineers on the call, so I'm sure they'd be happy to answer. If you have any questions about the technical stuff, I'll answer all of that at the end. So just please type them out and someone should help you. I have a lot of people on different teams online. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the basics of what a Flask API looks like. So the first line of code, we're just importing the Flask module from the Flask library. If you're comfortable with Python, you already know how modules and libraries work. But libraries are just a set of code that give you functions that you can use in your program. Then the next thing we do is we set up the app, and we are using a variable that's specific to Python, so the name variable, and that variable just lets Python know whether the program that you are running is in this file or in a different file. Then the next thing we have is a decorator. So I'm gonna go into decorators further later on, but in the case of APIs, we're gonna use decorators to help us make the routes. And then we have a function, and this just returns hello world. In this version of the API, we're just running that on a port because this is a really simple API. You can decide to do that in your API. You can just leave it to be a default when you're just working through these things. It doesn't really matter, especially if you're just doing a personal project. Okay, and then setting up the virtual environment so that you can run the code in the repositories, pardon me. So this is just how to set up your virtual environment. And if you are on a Windows, there are instructions on the README on the repositories for how to set up pip so that you can install Flask using pip install Flask. So I'm gonna leave this up for a second again so people can set up their virtual environment. So I just wanna talk about this really quick because we're not gonna do a lot with the virtual environment during the workshop, but I think it's important that I bring up why I want you to set up a virtual environment. One thing about Flask is that on some code editors, Flask requires you to set up your environment a little bit differently so that it's able to run. So this avoids that situation because if Flask is installed in your virtual environment, then you don't have to worry about what other environments you have or what else is going on in your code editor or in your computer because you're setting up an environment that's prepared to use Flask. So I recommend doing that in projects both for yourself and projects where you are sharing your code with other people because it will make it easier for you all to have the same environment. So if you have questions, again, please post in the chat. Someone will help you. If not, we'll just keep moving along. So, and one other thing that I wanted to get into before I get into actual endpoints or anything like that is what is JSON? Because we're gonna use JSON for both some of the responses we get from our API and some of the data that we send to our API. So like we talked about earlier, an API takes a request that might have information like a JSON body and it returns a response. So it's helpful to know what JSON is, and JSON is just JavaScript object notation. It's just data organized in key value pairs, and it's just separated by commas, and square brackets in JSON have arrays and curly brackets hold objects, and that's pretty much all you need to know. When you look at a JSON object, they're pretty descriptive, so we don't have to get too in depth on that. So now we're gonna get to the first API endpoint type or request method. And this is the GET request. This is the most common request you're going to use in any API. And a GET request pulls a specific piece of data or a group of data, or it gets a resource, is essentially what it does. And this is an idempotent method. And so that means that this method is expected to have the same response every time from the API. So if I have an API and it's an API for getting pictures, every single time that I make a GET request to pull bird pictures, I expect that it's going to get bird pictures. Nothing super exciting is going to happen, and I'm not going to change any data that is either already in my code or that is in a database somewhere. None of that is going to change. And the parameters for a GET request are typically in the URL. So I have some examples of some GET requests. So if you were to go into your browser, and you can try this out while I'm talking about it, or you can just listen to me. If you did http://google.com/, that would be doing the request on the right, which is a GET to just the slash, because that's the route that we're doing. There's nothing behind the slash. And then it's an HTTP method, and you're using the 1.1 protocol, which is the most common protocol for APIs. We won't get really into that in this workshop because typically, unless you want a faster protocol, you will just use 1.1 by default. And the host is google.com. And then the Twitter request is just the same kind of thing. So if you go into the repository, you will see the service route. So you can go look at it on your own, or you can just look on the screen. So we're going to talk through what's going on in this route and how it works. So the first thing that you see is you see a decorator, and that's that app.route. So a decorator adds functionality to a method. So if you were to just have the get services function that's underneath that without the decorator, then you wouldn't have an API route. But since we added the decorator, we are making this an API route. If you look, we use the methods and we put get because that's the only method we're using here. And I do have some code for not making slashes strict. I won't get too much into this, but essentially that just lets your API know whether you're okay with users having a slash at the end of the route or not. If you don't really care about it, you can just write the same kind of code that I have and just make that false. So if we get into the actual method, what we're doing here is we are just getting the services object and we're making that our data. So we're gonna go ahead and JSONify that. So we're gonna put it into the kind of format that we discussed earlier, which is just key value pairs. And we're giving that response object the status code property, and we're setting that to 200 because that's the status code that we're using when things go correctly. And we are returning the response. So if we were to put that into Postman, which is a tool that you can use to send requests to APIs, and I'll pull that tool up later just so you can get comfortable with how it looks like and how you can use it. If we were to do that, like you saw earlier, so this is just set to my port and I just set it to a default. And you see I use the slash services route. So that's the route. Anything after that slash is my route. And as you can see, I don't have a body in there because the get request doesn't need one. And when I click send, this is what I am getting back. So in that services object, right now, there's just a service called custom machining. And so that's what the API returns to me. What is a post request? Sorry. A post request is the second most common type of API request. So it modifies a resource. So it is not idempotent because different things can happen when you're modifying resources. So every time you make a post request, things might be a little bit different. The parameters are sent separately from the request. And this is because in post requests, you can have as much data as you want unless you write an API that limits that amount. So people can send in giant things, giant pieces of data or giant resources into your API if they wanted to. And then the headers identify the type of data sent to the request. So in the GET request, we didn't have any headers because we weren't sending in anything separate from the parameters in our actual URL or request. As you've noticed in APIs, the request is what you would see as like a browser URL. So here we have an example of what it would look like if you were going to make a post to Twitter. And I kind of shortened it a little bit because they have a lot of authentication stuff in their requests. But as you see, we have our host again. We have what kind of request we're making, and then we have the content type, the JSON right down here. So we'll look at this. And so if we look at our decorator, there's a little bit more going on, but not that much. We have our method set to post. We have our route. So we're trying to post to locations. And then inside of locations, we're posting to a specific location. So it might help if you look at the object that contains the locations. So the structure will make more sense. So this is the location name, and we did string name here because there's different ways to basically set up your routes. But if you want to take input from the user, then you want to have a variable here that can be changed by them. So that's why we have string name and then string service. They don't necessarily need to be name or service. You could set them to anything. I just think it makes sense to use what they're referring to. Then we have a function to create the service. So we're taking the name that we took from the string up here. We're taking the service that was a string up here. And then here, I commented this out because there are two different ways to do this. You could use request.args or request.getJSON, depending on whether you were forcing that data to be JSON or not. But for our examples, we are using JSON. So we're making an object here called request data. So we're just going through, and in Python, we're going through for each location in the list of locations, if the location, if the property of name in that specific location matches the string that the person put in the request, then we're going to go ahead and look for the services in that location. And if the property of service type for that service matches the service that the person put, we're going to go ahead and give them a message that they're trying to update a service, but the service already exists. Because you want to make sure that your API handles all the possibilities of things that could happen when someone is making that request. So one possibility could be that the service already exists. If the service doesn't exist, what we're doing here is that we're creating an object that is mapped to what the user puts in. So as you can see, we created our request data, which is based on the JSON the user puts in, and we're mapping that out to the different parts that are inside of the service type and the details. So if that service doesn't exist, then we're going to add it to our list of services for that specific location. And if you look at the bottom, if that location doesn't exist, so way at the beginning, if when we were doing our original loop that doesn't exist, then we return a message to the user that that could not be created. So we'll go ahead and look at how this could look in Postman. So as you see, the route is exactly the way we saw earlier. So if you look back, we need the location, we need the locations, and then we need the name of the location and the name of the service. So I put in that same kind of information. So I filled out the JSON object that my API is expecting. And then this is what I get in return when I send it. And I'm actually gonna go ahead and go to Postman for this part. And if you are trying to follow along and run the code at the same time as I am, you might wanna use the completed version of the repository as it's already running. Or yeah, and you can copy that into your version of the repository, which is the initial, so that you can build on that further. So I'll go ahead and show you Postman now. 1 second. Okay, wonderful. Oh, and you should be able to see Postman now. Okay, cool, wonderful. And then my API is running. So we'll just do a, sorry, we're just gonna do a post. So we have the location, the name of the location, and then this was the one we already saw, but you could really set this to anything, of course. So I'll do tires. I'm just trying to follow our API here and just do something that's relevant. So in this example of the API, this is an API for a business that does automotive work, but you could do an API for anything. The principles still apply. And I'm so sorry, I have so many tabs up. Okay, so I'm gonna send this to our API. And as you see, I got a response. So my response went well because you see that I got the same stuff back from the API as what I sent in. And if we go to my terminal, if we go to my terminal, you can see that I am getting a 201, which is the exact same type of code that we wrote into our API and that we would be expecting. So let's go back. All right. So now the next type of request that we're going to talk about is a put request. So a put request creates or updates a resource, and it is idempotent. So this is different than a post request because a put request has the same, you have the same expectations for the request every single time. So if I were to do a put request over and over for the same service, and the service already exists, then a put request would just try to update the service over and over and over. If the service did not exist, then the put request will just try to create it. A post request is different than a put request because since a post request doesn't have the same result every single time, you could end up creating the same object over and over. So if your API was linked to a database and you're letting people enter the same information over and over, that might not be the best if you're looking to get unique data. So those are the kind of situations that are the reason that you want to check that the user inputs what you're willing to take in from your API. And this request is pretty similar to the post request that we saw earlier because as you see, we're sending JSON. We have the headers that say that we're sending JSON, and we are telling the request that it is a put type. So, okay. So now we're looking at the put request. So you can see that this is really similar to what we've been doing before. So inside of our decorator, we have /services. So we're going to be trying to do something with that information. And then we are taking in a service name. So we expect that the user would put in something to the service name. The reason that it's important that the user follows the protocols that you have written in your API is, for example, if I didn't have any other methods for /services /string service name, I didn't have any other methods to do anything with, then my API expects that I can only do a put to that specific route. And if I were to be missing the service name right here, that string wasn't there, and there were no other routes with /services, then our API wouldn't know how to handle that. Since we do have other routes, we do have the /services routes. If the person leaves off the service name right here, then they could make a GET request and get the services, but if they tried to do a put, it wouldn't work. So again, we're getting the JSON data, and these are just the functions that I wrote. One thing I want to call out is that you can do this differently depending on how your data is structured. This is just the most simple way to pull that kind of data. So I want to take a little bit of time on this endpoint and see how there's a few things that are a little bit different than the other endpoint. And these are kind of stylistic choices that you can make in writing your Python. For example, we formatted the service name instead of just having it be text in here, and that's just a difference in how people write their Python. You really could just end the quotes and do a plus here. We also have a status code of 202, which is a little bit different than some of the other status codes we've had before, and I will be talking about that a little bit later. We're doing the same thing with the put. We're adding this. We're adding in what we got as the request data to the list of services. So this is really similar to the post endpoint, but again, they just are slightly different protocols because this one will have the same expectations every single time. And then as you can see, there's a difference between whether you're updating the service and whether you're creating the service. You could potentially have these split out in separate functions, but it's a lot easier to have it all together and it wouldn't really make sense to split it out. And then the put request. So we're making a put request to enter custom rims. So if custom rims doesn't exist, as you can see, the API gives us a message that custom rims was created. If we did a put request and custom rims did exist already, then we would just get information that custom rims has been updated. So,
Erica, can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
So we've gone through a lot of information pretty quickly, and if people are following along, I just wanted to give people a chance to ask questions if you're not doing it during the chat, or comment in the chat where you are if you're coding along.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good call out, Jen. Maybe we can slow down a little bit just to give people, okay. Post is, Yeah, so Akansha asked a question that I think a lot of people probably have, whether put is equal to update and post is equal to write. So you might have situations where someone will use post to update, but that is not necessarily a recommended way to use that protocol because, like we mentioned earlier, you might have a situation where the post endpoint doesn't always behave the same way for the same object being sent in, whereas the put would. So it's better to use put for update than to use post. We would use post for creating. And then how are you passing data in the put scenario? Okay, that's a really good question. So let's go back to that. Let's go back to Postman. I think that would be helpful. Okay, so we have the put endpoint here. So in the put, and actually before I show you Postman, let me show you, let's go back a little bit in the presentation. Let's go back to put. Okay, so if you look at the put endpoint, you can see that it's going to, what is going to get into request data is what is going in the request and is sent in as JSON. So it has to be JSON. And the service type needs to be there. If, sorry, no, if the service type already exists and we're looking at service type being sent in as part of the request, then what is in the request details is the information that is going to go into the service details in either the update to the object or in creating that. So if we go back to Postman, so you can see here that we created as part of our JSON object, we have details right here, and we have a price and an explanation. So since we mapped whatever is in the request as JSON to be the request data, then what is in details here is also going to be in the details of the object that you're sending through the API. So we could have, if you wanted to be able to look at this a little better, what I would do is that you could go to the put for services in the completed code and change what you are returning to be the actual request data rather than this message. And that would be a pretty easy switch. If we go back to the code, so you see here that my response, what I put in data is just this message. You could easily change that to just be request data instead and have that be returned to you so that you can see that. Okay. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else. Oh, how to find out what port it is running on. Okay, so when you, we can go back a little bit as well, just in case someone else is going through this. Okay, after you run the Flask run command, it will show you what port it's on. I'm gonna go ahead and show you my terminal. Cool. So yours might look a little bit different, but you can see that right here I have a line that says running on, and this is what you copy into Postman, and then after that slash you put in whatever route you are trying to access or work with, and that will let you make those requests. So Typically, like Malia called out, the default is 5,000. You can change this, but if you didn't change anything, then it should be on that port. Is there anything else before we move forward? I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was going so quick. Is there a Postman file for API calls? No, I did not provide one, but that is actually a really good call, Gabriel. And I do have a set of API like Postman calls that I made, so I can go ahead and add all of those either to a README or just share a Postman library with everyone after the event. So I'll go ahead and do that and just link that in the comments in case you want to use the same requests and modify them. It'll make it easier to play around with the API. Is there anything else that would be helpful for me to discuss right now?
Are you going to be sharing your slides?
Oh yes, I will be sharing my slides.
Awesome. That will be super helpful if people want to go through again and do this at home.
Exactly. And I do have some links to some open roles as well. So if someone were to be interested in those, then that would be good too, to have those links. Okay, and I think someone is already answering Anita's questions. So I'll go back to my slides. So the last type of request that we're going to talk about is a delete request. So a delete request deletes a resource, like its name says. It is also idempotent, so every time that you make a delete, you expect to try to delete a resource. And the parameters can be in the URL or in the body. So I did write in here, there is a content type for a header, and we do have JSON, but you don't have to do that actually. If you're writing a pretty simple delete route and you want to keep your function kind of simple, you can write a function so that you're not requesting a body or getting data from the user, and that is totally okay. So here, as you can see, this is actually a pretty simple delete method. We're not getting a body from the user at all. We're using the URL completely. So the route that we're using is /services/service name. So this lets you know pretty quickly that we're deleting a service, and you can see our function is just taking that service name. So we're just doing a loop in here. So for each service in our service objects, if the property of service type matches what you put in for the service name at the end of your URL, then we remove the service. If not, then the service does not exist because it didn't match any of the services in the service list. This endpoint is a little different than the other endpoints because you can see the abort. So you can decide to use or not use aborts in your API. So if you do use an abort, it's a little bit more of a strict error that your user gets because it displays differently to the user and it basically halts everything that is going on. You could also have a less strict API and you could just return a message the way we've been returning responses for everything else. This is just kind of a decision that you would have to make when you structure your own API. And as you can see, since our delete endpoint is pretty simple, when you go to /services/frame repair, if frame repair exists, then you get a message that says service frame repair is deleted. And then we're just going to talk about status codes. So there are a lot of status codes, and I only used a few in writing this API. So the status codes tell you what has happened with the request that you made to the API or the web server, because an API is also commonly thought of as a web server. So a 200 means okay. A 201 means created. A 202 means accepted. A 404 is a bad request, and a 400 is a bad request, and a 404 is not found. So if we go back, for this, we're giving a 404 because we're looking for a service. So if we can't match to a specific service type, then we can't find it and we can't do anything there. So that's why we're returning a 404. So for status codes, there are 5 different kinds of status codes. So there's 100 status codes, which are informative, 200 status codes, which relate to success, 300 status codes are for redirection, 400 is for when there is a client error, like when we have the not found, and 500 is for a server error. So if you've gone on a website before and you've gotten a 500 error before, then that is because there is an issue with their server. And thank you, someone just provided you with a list of HTTP status codes. I recommend that when you are writing your own API, that you look at all of the status codes available and you match them to what you are doing specifically. Some of the ones we used are some of the most common ones, but it's possible that you might have a different situation and you just want to make sure that the status code is as informative as it can be. And then steps that we can take, and I'm sorry, I really did fly through all the information. Steps that you can take is that I would recommend starting out with manipulating and adding data and resources. So you have the locations set of resources that are able to be pulled by your API, and you have the services. I recommend changing the structures of those, adding new things, removing things. Also adding additional status codes for other scenarios, creating additional versions of each endpoint. As you can see, there's only one put, one delete, one post, and there's a ton of get endpoints. So I recommend going through and practicing those endpoints. So you could add a put for locations, you could add a post for services that are not for a specific location, those kinds of things. I recommend learning about pip lock. We set up a virtual environment to make it easy to use Flask, and so that you could install things specifically to that virtual environment. But if you are working with others, then pip lock will allow you to lock that environment and not have people change things. So if you're working with other people and you want everyone to use the same version of Python or something like that, then that is a good option. You can switch your API to be reliant on a database instead of data in the code. This is something I really recommend. I did not want to start out with that in this kind of workshop because it is a little bit more complicated. And then you could also connect your API to a front end. So obviously a lot of the APIs that you look at, like the weather app on your phone, or when you go to Google, which uses a ton of different APIs, you see a front end. I think that that really adds a lot. And if your API is going to serve information to users rather than to another application, then it makes sense to have a front end. And that is actually the end of all of the technical information I had for everyone. Does anyone have any other questions about the technical stuff specifically, or anything I can go back to or show you right now? Yeah, what would you like to know about decorators? What would be helpful? And Will, if you want to jump in, I know that you know a lot about decorators. Maybe a good question for you to answer.
I'll give it a shot. So decorators are, they're fairly confusing. Maybe I'll post a resource for them, a link to some more resources. But basically that route decorator is taking the function that you define below it, and then it's adding a lot of other functionality behind the scenes to do the actual routing. So that's sort of the short version, is that it's decorating your function with some more functionality. They're pretty neat to try to make your own.
Do we have any other questions? Could you show the decorator example? Yeah, we can go back to any decorator because we use them throughout pretty much every single endpoint. So this app.route is the decorator. So if we did not have that, then this code right here would just be an independent function. When we add the decorator, then we can let our code know that we can use the API method delete on that specific chunk of code. Do you mind clarifying your question, Jen?
Oh, I think she's asking about the specific route decorator. Yeah, you can actually look this up. It's only a few lines of code, I think. I'll try to find that example and post it as well. But yeah, basically the reason you use it is that it allows you to, it takes the function that you defined that Erica has here, delete service, and it passes that entire function to another function along with the other parameters that you defined in the route, like the services / string, service name, and the methods. And I'll try to find that example now.
What is JSONify? That's a good question. So JSONify just puts whatever chunk of data you're sending it to, and it creates it into a JSON object. So it can either be passed to something else as a JSON object, or so that you can display it as a JSON object. It just puts the data into a set of key value pairs depending on how you already structured your data.
Erica, I might have missed it when I was answering questions. Did you actually show Postman?
Yes. Yes, we went over how to put in, and we can show that one more time before I show. So this is what Postman looks like. And if you need to send something in with a header, you can select your headers. You don't actually need all of these. Most of these are suggested. For this API specifically, the only one you really need is content type. And then I would set that to application dash JSON. And there is a default version for that in these headers. So that's why you can't really see it on my end, because I'm just using the default part. Maybe it'll show better on the post if we go to these headers. Yeah, so you can see content type here and application / JSON. So that's where you would put in this header. And again, this is the only one you really need for this API. You might need other ones for other APIs. So I think it's worth messing around on Postman and looking at them. And then your body, the JSON that you're sending in, is just here. And we just created an object that matches what the API is looking for. So, and if you were to have an API that you have users, then you could give them an example of a JSON object that they could send through so that they could format their JSON the exact same way. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to answering questions in a second. I just did want to let everyone know, I think Brigitte and Nicole did highlight this, but we are hiring in the US, and these are some of the positions that we are hiring for. And I am posting the slides, so if you're interested at looking into these, then please feel free to look at them, or if you know friends that would be interested in those kinds of positions. And now we're just back to the questions. I want to see. Get JSON.
Can I talk for just a second on the jobs?
Yeah.
Okay. On the team leader job, if you are interested, I would make sure that you definitely mention either in your cover letter or in your resume that you do have experience leading and managing people. We see a lot of great technical resumes, but they very much focus on the technical and not on the people skills. And it really is both jobs. And while it is not here, there is an intermediate software developer job, C#.net, coming out very, very soon, like in the next week or two. So please keep your eye out for that as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. Joe, can you explain your question a little bit further? You said, I want to see the JSON object that you were using in get.json. If you can tell me what request you're looking at, that might help. Okay, awesome. Let's go back to that. Cool, the put request. So in the put request, this request is formatted a little bit differently than the post request, because what we're really asking for from the user or the application interacting for our API is that they need to have they just need to have the details. So we're looking for the request data to have details. So request.getJSON is looking just for the JSON that gets submitted to this put request to have details. And if it has details, then we're returning that. Yeah. Yeah, so you could structure this both ways. It really depends on, it's really just a syntax difference. So if you look at the post where we have this new service object, you can create something like that for the put as well if you would like, or you can make it a little bit easier like the put here and just map the things out without creating its own object. It's really up to how you would like to write your code.
And the force equals true parameter allows you to be a little bit more accepting as well of the data that the request sends. In case they didn't specifically format their data as JSON data, if they sent it as text, then the force will just force that text into JSON. Do you want to show the, or I don't know if you have this, the request that this would be accepting in Postman?
Yeah, let's go ahead and look at that really quick. Okay. And then we look at the body. So.
Yep, and you can see here actually just above the body, there's a little drop down that says text. So when she sends this, she is actually technically sending it as a text type. And you can also click that little drop down and switch it to JSON and a few other different types.
Yeah. So the approach on the put request is a little more, like Will said, it accepts things that are a little bit different. So depending, again, on how strict you want your API to be, you can expect that they're sending in a specific kind of like JSON object or JSON setup, whatever you want to call it. Or you can be a little more forgiving and let people send text that pretty much looks like the JSON, and that would be okay. I'm just waiting to see if we get any other questions. I think a lot of the earlier ones were answered in the chat by everybody else. So.
Also, I just wanted to open up the floor for questions about Xero as well, not just the workshop. So feel free to ask anything in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Grace.
It's a different topic really, but there is a way, I think Erica mentioned it earlier, that you can use Flask to fill out a UI as well. So there's a special syntax you can use to create like a browser-based pages that handle this API request data as well. So that's kind of a fun thing to play around with if you like to have that graphical feedback.
Jen asked if we are using a DB or it's a memory store. So for this example specifically, we did not use a database. I would say that if you are trying to get more comfortable with working on APIs, then I would recommend using using a database in your API instead of having it in your actual application. I think that's a little bit cleaner too. And then, what is your favorite thing about working at Xero? Anyone could answer that. My favorite thing about working at Xero is just that I feel like I've gotten to have a lot of fun. I think that's a little bit corny, but in all of the teams that I've been on so far at Xero, I've really gotten to work on things that interest me and take a lot of time to do personal development. So I think that even if you were working on a project that wasn't your favorite, then you could use some of that personal development time to learn some skills that you think are really fun and interesting. So that's my favorite thing. If anyone else wants to chime in.
I'll share a little bit. I think, Erica just mentioned this and it's in Ben's response as well. A lot of people's favorite part about working at Xero comes down to the humans here and the people you work with. There's a lot of just smart people who are excited to be here. A lot of interesting challenges to solve, no matter what team you're on. It's a really quickly, fast-paced and quickly changing environment, which is great because it provides a lot of opportunity for growth, I think. And then I think also just working for a company which with such strong missions and values is pretty unique. It's good to know that the product that we're working on and that we're selling and that we're recruiting people for, no matter what your job is really making a difference in the life of small business owners and really solving a tangible and complex problem for them. They didn't get into their small business, whatever that might be, to do accounting. So to solve such a big problem for them, I think feels good. You really see the impact of the work we're doing.
Jen asked what our tech stack is, and Xero actually does use a lot of pretty interesting technology. We use AWS for our cloud technology. Our team uses a lot of Python, PowerShell, and Microsoft SQL Server. And then other teams have pretty different tech stacks. I don't know if some other folks want to chime in, but it's a lot of good either kind of cutting edge or industry standard stuff that is really fun to learn and is really applicable in lots of different scenarios.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of changes depending on what team you're on and what project you're doing. I've written Python, I've written JavaScript, Node.js, React, Golang. It really depends on who you're working with and then what they're trying to accomplish. And also sometimes what technologies people are trying to learn. Sometimes people will try to learn a technology alongside working on something. So.
Erica, I think we could move on to the conclusion if you're ready for that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to this workshop. This is my first time giving a workshop, so if you have feedback, please share it with me. This is definitely a learning experience for me. And we are really looking to have more women working in technology and product in Xero. So even if there's not a specific role that's up and open now, we'd love to be in touch with you and learn more about you. And we're really thankful to have had Women Who Code partner with us on this event. I personally am really passionate about what they do as an organization, and I'm really excited that Xero is passionate about what they do as well.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And Erica, huge shout out for putting this together and bringing this awesome group of people together. So your hard work paid off. This was really helpful for me. Thanks, everybody.